Okay, Matt, I'm seeing a number of questions here. I'm not sure. Do you just want me to maybe pick out a couple of questions?
Yeah, I think we got kind of a summary here as there's over 100 questions. So yeah, it's a couple of them I saw Beth related to if tribal IDs are not accepted, and it's I think it's somewhat related to our recommendation earlier on. So maybe you can cover a little bit about documents we're recommending folks have on them, and maybe talk a little bit about the tribal ID aspect again as well.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. As I had mentioned previously, a tribal ID is a valid form of identification in the United States. And we are hearing people when they say that ICE agents aren't accepting tribal IDs. But if that happens, we're recommending that folks use, or that folks ask for a supervisor if the ICE agent does not accept your tribal ID. Unfortunately, we are recommending that folks may want to also have a second form of identification on them, such as a state ID, a copy of your passport, a copy of your birth certificate, or some other form of identification. As I also mentioned, it's important that if you are a US citizen, you are not required to show proof of to have proof of US citizenship on you at all times. There's no federal law that says US citizens in the United States have to have proof that they are US citizens on them. And all an ICE agent should be asking for if you are a US citizen is identification. Um, there's it's challenging to talk about every single encounter with a NICE agent, but those are just our general recommendations.
Thanks, Beth.
Thank you.
There's also a couple here, Lenny, about one of the things you just discussed a little bit, and I did too, about ICE jurisdiction on reservations, and then the authority of tribes to prevent ICE from entering reservation lands as well. And I don't know if you want to go over that again. I know it's certainly an important question that folks have.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And again, as I stated earlier in my presentation, that as a general principle, ICE has the authority to enter uh, open tribal lands in order to enforce federal immigration laws. But that doesn't necessarily take into consideration unique circumstances that an individual tribe or community may have by virtue of their treaty or by virtue of the status of their reservation. And so, as a general principle, as a federal law enforcement agency, ICE does have the authority to enter tribal lands. However, I urge tribal leaders to contact their legal counsel for specific opinions on that may be important as it relates to that tribe's status, whether that tribe's public law 280 or not, whether that tribe's closed reservation or not, and any specific statutes or treaty provisions that may only apply to that reservation or community. I don't know, Matt, if you have anything more you want to say on that, but that
No, I
that that
think
would be
that's,
the guidance I would provide.
yep, I think that's spot on. Couple other questions, maybe Beth, this one can go to you too. And we had a slide showing the difference between an administrative warrant versus a judicial warrant. And I don't know if we can go back up to that slide, but there was a question about, kind of verifying the difference between the two. And so maybe if you want to just show that again, it could be helpful for folks.
Yeah, there's two photos here. The first slide is an example of an administrative warrant, and the second is an example of a judicial warrant. Like we mentioned earlier, the clearest way to tell the difference between the two is that an administrative warrant um, is typically signed by the ICE agent themselves or another ICE agent, and the judicial warrant is signed by a judge. And on the judicial warrant, you can look for a signature by someone who is a magistrate judge, a district court judge. You can look for the name of the court, and you won't see that on an administrative warrant.
Thanks, Beth. Question on tribally owned businesses and another question on employees who work at home. I think the general guidance about private spaces where ICE can be refused entry, for Fourth Amendment purposes for businesses and nonprofits applies on the reservation as well as off. And so, those constitutional rights are applicable regardless. So, in terms of private spaces for businesses on reservations, I think still those same rules apply, right? So, indicating that these are private businesses, there's no trespassing, and setting up those policies and procedures can help protect you to ensure and show that these are indeed private spaces and that a judicial warrant is needed to be able for them to search and enter them. The same kind of general guidance applies. For businesses or nonprofits that have folks that work at home, I think the general guidance for individuals when they're in their home will apply for those individuals. And then, for businesses, generally you don't have to provide information on your employees unless they have a judicial warrant to obtain that information. So I think those are kind of the general rules there as well.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I see a question. What kinds of reasons fall under reasonable suspicion or probable cause? I think it's important to note that reasonable suspicion and probable cause are two different standards. Reasonable suspicion is the lower standard, and really all it requires is that there are what's called articulable facts, that the officer can identify and articulate facts that the person may be involved in committing a crime. And for reasonable suspicion, the threshold there is only for a brief stop and discussion or encounter with the individual. Probable cause is a higher standard, and it's more evidence-based. And really, it requires evidence that it's more likely than not that a crime was committed. And probable cause, what the threshold for that and what's allowed under probable cause are things like arrests that can take place, or actually able to search an area. And also probable cause is the standard to obtain a warrant, a judicial warrant that Matt was just talking about. And so reasonable suspicion, again, is the lower standard, and really all it's based on is facts that an officer can articulate that a person may have been involved in the commission of a crime. And that's really a circumstance-based analysis.
Thanks, Lenny.
Yep.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I don't know, Beth or Matt, if you have anything you want to add on that.
No, I think it is just highlighting that reasonable suspicion, right, is a much lower standard. And I think in the context of ICE, it's more about whether or not there's reasonable suspicion that you are in the United States unlawfully too, right? Their jurisdiction is more limited. Let's see, we do have a question about Canadian citizens in the Jay Treaty. I don't know, Lenny, if you're familiar with how, the Jay Treaty works and operates. I know this is something we're beginning to look at here at NARF, but I do know, from a basic understanding that there is a provision in the United States Code, I believe it's 8 USC 1359, that kind of codifies the Jay Treaty and allows Native, Canadians, Indigenous folks from Canada to move freely across the borders. But I don't know beyond that. I know that right exists, and there's probably specific guidance that we're not going to get into today, but maybe something we can look into. Unless Lenny, you have some specific guidance at the ready on that front.
No, all I have is the statute that you pointed to, and I think that's appropriate. It is important to note, I think, that the United States continues to recognize the right of Indigenous people in Canada to cross freely into the United States. That's not necessarily the case. I do just want to clarify that that's not necessarily the case with Indigenous people from the United States to cross freely into Canada, because the Jay Treaty was with the British Crown. It wasn't necessarily with the Canadian government, and so they don't recognize the Jay Treaty doesn't have the same status under the Canadian government as we continue to recognize it in the United States. But we do have it codified, and there is that provision within federal law that allows Canadian individuals to travel back and forth.
Thank you. We're getting close to time here. I did see a question about requests to NARF, in particular if there's emergency situations, and yes, absolutely. I think we've put our contact information in, but we can certainly share that as well. You can see our emails here, but also 303-447-8760 is our phone number. And we are certainly have been speaking on an emergency basis to individuals that have been detained and working with our networks to secure them counsel locally and then talk about their situation. So we are here and trying to be a resource to do that. I know our capacity is limited, but we have a great team here with Beth and Jacqueline, Allison, Malia, and others here at NARF that have been putting in the time to make sure we can provide resources for our people. Don't know if there's any other, I think we've answered most of the grouped questions that have come in. I don't know if there's any that we should flag any further. I'm just kind of looking here. I don't know if you're seeing any, Lenny.
I think there's a lot of good questions, and I think that some of the presentation we did answered some of the other questions as we're going through. I think maybe just important to respect everybody's time. Maybe we can go through and just do a round of closing remarks.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea.
Maybe we can start with Beth, and then me, and then go to Matt, and then Larry if he's available to wrap up.